What if everything you were told about your enemy was a lie? What if the moment you expected cruelty, you received compassion instead? This is the story of Japanese women prisoners of war who discovered that humanity can shine brightest in the darkest of times, and how a single smile changed everything they believed about survival, honor, and the true nature of their captors. Before we dive into this incredible true story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard about this forgotten chapter of World War II history. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more people who need to hear them. August 1945. The war had ended, but for thousands of Japanese civilians scattered across British prison camps in Singapore, Malaysia, and Burma, the silence felt heavier than any bomb. These weren't soldiers. They were nurses, teachers, mothers, and daughters who had followed the Imperial Army's expansion into Southeast Asia, believing in their nation's divine mission. Now they sat behind barbed wire, skeletal and trembling, waiting for a punishment they had been conditioned to expect. Their own propaganda had painted a horrifying picture of what Allied forces did to prisoners, especially women: dishonor, torture, death. Some had already made peace with never seeing their families again. Others clutched hidden shards of glass, contemplating a final escape from the shame of capture. But what happened when British soldiers finally opened those gates would shatter every assumption they held and expose the cruelest lie their own government had ever told them. Our story centers on a group of women held in a makeshift camp outside Singapore, but their experience echoed across dozens of similar camps throughout the region. Among them was Miyako, a former schoolteacher from Osaka who had volunteered as a civilian administrator in occupied Malaya. She was 32 years old but looked 50, her once bright eyes now sunken and dim. Beside her sat Keiko, barely 20, a nurse who had watched patients die in her arms when medicine ran out. There was Harumi, a mother of two whose husband served in the Imperial Navy, and whose children she hadn't seen in 3 years. And Sachiko, the youngest at 18, who had come to Singapore with dreams of serving the Emperor, and now couldn't stop her hands from shaking. These women represented different lives, different stories, but shared one commonality. They had been systematically taught that capture by Western forces meant a fate worse than death. The imperial propaganda machine had been thorough, flooding their minds with tales of Allied barbarity, of prisoners tortured and violated. Surrender, they were told, was the ultimate betrayal of their race and nation. Better to die with honor than live in shame. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, news trickled slowly into the camps. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast finally reached them through hushed whispers, many of the women wept, not from relief, but from terror. The war was over, which meant their usefulness had ended. What need would the British have for Japanese prisoners now? Surely, they thought, the reckoning would be swift and merciless. Days passed in agonizing limbo. Guards who had been relatively neutral became scarce. Food, already minimal, dwindled to almost nothing. The women huddled together at night, sharing whispered prayers to ancestors, preparing their spirits for whatever horror dawn might bring. Some wrote final letters they knew would never be sent. Others simply stared through the fence at the jungle beyond, wondering if freedom would have been worth the dishonor of survival. Then, on a sweltering morning in late August, they heard the trucks. The rumbling of engines sent panic rippling through the camp like electricity. Women clutched each other, some openly sobbing, others frozen in silent dread. This was it, the moment they had been warned about their entire lives. The gates swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo forever. But instead of the expected assault, instead of soldiers storming in with violence and vengeance, what emerged stopped time itself. British soldiers stepped through, but their rifles were slung over their shoulders, not aimed. Their hands were empty or carrying medical supplies. And on their faces, weathered and scarred by years of brutal jungle warfare, exhausted beyond measure, was something the women had never expected to see directed at them. Smiles. Gentle, weary, compassionate smiles. The lead officer, a captain named James Whitmore, was 41 years old and had spent 3 years fighting through Burma. He had lost men to disease, ambush, and the merciless conditions of the Pacific Theater. He had every reason to hate the empire these women represented. His own brother had died in a Japanese POW camp building the Burma Railway, starved and worked to death. Yet when he looked at the skeletal figures before him, trembling and terrified, he saw not enemies but victims of the same war that had consumed them all. He had been briefed on what to expect. Japanese prisoners conditioned to fear the worst, potentially suicidal, certainly traumatized. His orders were clear: treat them with dignity, provide medical care, and prepare them for repatriation. But orders were one thing. The humanity required to execute them was another. "We're here to help," he said in halting Japanese, words he had practiced with a translator on the drive over. "The war is finished. You're safe now." The women didn't move. Miyako, the schoolteacher, stared at him with eyes that held no trust, only calculation. Was this a trick? A cruel game before the real punishment began? In her mind, she replayed every propaganda film she had ever watched, every horrific story she had heard about Western soldiers. This kindness had to be a facade. Keiko, the nurse, noticed the medical bags. The soldiers carried and felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. She had been a healer once. She recognized the universal symbols on those supplies. But still, she couldn't reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been taught to expect. One of the younger women, Sachiko, began to hyperventilate, convinced this was the calm before violence. An older woman tried to pull her back, whispering desperately that they should show no weakness, that they must maintain dignity even in their final moments. Captain Whitmore could see the terror, could feel the wall of mistrust that separated him from these women, despite only a few meters of physical distance. He turned to his men, exhausted soldiers who had fought beside him through hell, and gave them the most important order of the day. "Show them we mean it. Slowly. No sudden movements. Just help." What followed was a scene so delicate, so fraught with the weight of history and propaganda, that it felt like walking on shattered glass. A young British medic named Thomas approached Harumi, the mother, who was clearly ill with fever. He knelt at a respectful distance, opened his medical kit, and simply held up a canteen of clean water. He didn't force it on her. He didn't speak. He just offered, with a small, sad smile that said he understood her fear. Harumi stared at the canteen as if it were a weapon. Her hands wouldn't move. Her mind screamed that this was impossible, that kindness from the enemy was the cruelest deception of all. But her body, ravaged by dehydration and disease, betrayed her convictions. She reached out with a trembling hand, half expecting him to strike her. Instead, he gently placed the canteen in her palm, nodded, and stepped back to give her space. The moment Harumi lifted that canteen to her cracked lips and tasted clean water for the first time in weeks, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but the wall of lies that had been built around it. Tears streamed down her face as she drank, and the young medic's smile widened just a fraction, not in triumph, but in shared relief. Around the camp, similar scenes unfolded. Another soldier approached Keiko with bandages and antiseptic, gesturing to the infected wound on her arm that had been festering for days. She flinched when he came close, but he stopped, waited, and tried again. When she finally nodded, he treated her wound with a gentleness that contradicted every nightmare she had been fed. An older sergeant with gray in his beard sat down near Sachiko, who was still shaking uncontrollably. He didn't touch her. He just opened a ration pack, broke off a piece of chocolate, and placed it on the ground between them, then moved away. It took 10 minutes before Sachiko's curiosity and hunger overcame her fear enough to reach for it. When she tasted sweetness for the first time in months, she looked up at the sergeant with eyes full of confusion and disbelief. He simply nodded and smiled. But not everyone was convinced. Among the women was a group led by a former government clerk named Yuki, 35 years old, hardened by years of imperial indoctrination, and fiercely proud despite her circumstances. She had been a true believer in the cause, in Japan's destiny to lead Asia, and she viewed these British soldiers not as liberators, but as representatives of the colonial powers her nation had fought to expel. When she saw her fellow prisoners accepting water and medicine, she felt not gratitude but rage. "They're trying to humiliate us," she hissed to those around her. "This is how they break our spirit before they break our bodies. Don't you see? They want us weak and grateful so they can parade us as proof of their superiority." Her words found purchase among some of the women who were too frightened or too proud to accept what they were seeing. Yuki rose on unsteady legs, her voice growing louder, her finger pointed accusingly at Captain Whitmore. "We know what you are. We know what you do to prisoners. This mercy is a lie." The tension in the camp, which had been slowly diffusing, suddenly crystallized again into something sharp and dangerous. All eyes turned to Yuki, then to the captain. The British soldiers tensed, hands instinctively moving toward weapons, not to use them but out of trained reflex. This was the moment that could spiral into tragedy, where misunderstanding and fear could undo everything. Captain Whitmore held up his hand, signaling his men to hold their positions. He walked slowly toward Yuki, and with each step, the silence grew heavier. When he was 3 meters away, he stopped and did something unexpected. He removed his cap, a gesture of respect in military tradition, and spoke directly to her in careful, deliberate Japanese. "You have every right to your anger. You have every right not to trust us. War has taught you that trust is dangerous." He paused, letting his words settle. "But I'm not here to conquer you. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here because the war is over, and we are all human beings who deserve to go home." Yuki's eyes blazed with defiance, but there was something else there too. Something she was fighting desperately to suppress. Hope. The most dangerous emotion for someone who had convinced themselves that hope was foolishness. "Lies!" she spat, though her voice wavered. "You want us to be grateful to our captors. You want us to forget who we are." Captain Whitmore nodded slowly, acknowledging her words, rather than dismissing them. "I don't want you to forget who you are. I want you to remember something your leaders tried to make you forget. That your worth as a human being doesn't depend on victory or defeat. It doesn't depend on who wins a war. It depends on something much deeper than that." He gestured to his men, who stood watching with a mixture of exhaustion and something like sorrow. "These soldiers have fought your army for 3 years. They've lost friends, brothers. My own brother died in a Japanese prison camp. I have every reason to hate you." The words hit the women like a physical blow. Captain Whitmore's brother died in their custody. The admission hung in the air, validation of their worst fears. Now surely the mask would drop. Now the revenge would come. But instead Captain Whitmore's voice remained steady, his eyes clear. "But I don't hate you. Because hatred is what got us all here in the first place. Hatred is what convinced young men to die for miles of jungle. Hatred is what convinced your leaders to tell you we were monsters. And hatred is what would make me become the monster they said I was." He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. "I won't give war that victory. I won't become what it wants me to be. And neither should you." The silence that followed was profound. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Yuki stood trembling, not from fear but from the collision of everything she had believed with. The reality standing before her. Her mind raced for counter-arguments, for some way to dismiss his words as manipulation, but the sincerity in his voice, the pain in his eyes when he mentioned his brother, the complete absence of malice despite having every justification for it, these were not things that could be easily explained away by propaganda. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, to her own horror and surprise, tears began to stream down her face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release, of a burden she had carried for so long finally being lifted. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you show us mercy?" Captain Whitmore smiled then, that same tired, compassionate smile that had started this entire transformation. "Because someone has to be the first to stop the cycle. Someone has to be the one to say, the fighting ends here. And because, whether you believe it or not right now, you deserve it. Not because of what you've done or who you've served, but because you're human. And that's enough." He extended his hand toward her, not as a conqueror to the conquered, but as one human to another. For a long moment Yuki stared at that outstretched hand, as if it were the most complex puzzle in the world. Everything in her training screamed that accepting it would be a betrayal, a surrender of something sacred. But another voice, quieter and deeper, whispered that perhaps the real betrayal was rejecting compassion when it was freely offered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her hand began to rise. When their hands met, something shifted in that camp. It was subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in ice before the spring thaw. Other women who had been watching began to emerge from their defensive huddles. Miyako, the schoolteacher, approached one of the British soldiers and, in halting English, asked if they truly had medicine for the sick. When he nodded and immediately began organizing medical care, she covered her mouth and wept. Keiko, the nurse, found herself working alongside British medics, her professional instincts overriding her indoctrination as they treated the most critical cases together. The language barrier meant nothing when hands worked in concert to save lives. Harumi, the mother, sat with the young medic who had first given her water and, through gestures and broken phrases, showed him pictures of her children she had kept hidden. He showed her pictures of his own family back in Manchester. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, but in that moment, they spoke the universal language of parenthood and longing for home. But the story didn't end there. As days passed and trust slowly built, the women began to share their own experiences, and the British soldiers learned the depth of the propaganda they had been subjected to. The women had been told that Allied soldiers would assault them, that capture meant torture and death, that mercy was a Western concept that didn't apply to enemies of the empire. They had been shown fabricated photographs, told exaggerated stories, and systematically prepared to fear the very people who were now treating their wounds and sharing their rations. The revelation of this systematic deception created a new kind of pain among the women, the pain of realizing how thoroughly they had been manipulated by their own leaders. "We were afraid of the wrong people," Miyako said one evening to Captain Whitmore, who had taken to spending time in the Ocean camp each day, not as a warden but as a presence of reassurance. "Our own government made us fear you more than we feared death itself. They told us honor meant dying rather than facing you. But they lied about what honor really is." Captain Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "Every side tells lies in war. It's how they keep people fighting even when fighting doesn't make sense anymore. The truth is always the first casualty." He looked around at the women, growing stronger each day, beginning to smile occasionally, rediscovering hope. "But the war is over now. And that means we can choose truth over lies, mercy over vengeance, humanity over hatred. That's the real victory, the only one that matters." As the weeks progressed and arrangements were made for repatriation, something remarkable developed in that camp. Friendships formed across the linguistic and cultural divide. British soldiers taught Japanese women English phrases. The women taught soldiers Japanese customs and songs. They shared stories of home, of the lives they hoped to return to, of the futures they wanted to build. When the day finally came for the women to board ships back to Japan, there were tears on both sides. Not tears of joy at separation, but tears of gratitude for an unexpected gift. The discovery that humanity could survive even the worst humanity could inflict on itself. Yuki, who had been the most resistant, sought out Captain Whitmore on the final day. Through a translator, she spoke words that came from a place deeper than pride or ideology. "I was taught that you were less than human, that Western soldiers had no honor, no compassion, no soul. I believed these lies because I wanted to believe my suffering had meaning, that my sacrifice was for something noble. But you showed me that the real nobility is in choosing kindness when you have every reason to choose cruelty. You had power over us. You had justification for revenge. But you chose mercy instead. I don't have words in my language or yours for how profoundly that has changed me." She bowed deeply, a gesture of respect reserved for the most honored. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the kindness you showed when I deserved it least." Captain Whitmore returned the bow, his eyes glistening. "You deserved it always. You just needed someone to show you that. Now go home. Rebuild. Live the life your leaders tried to take from you. And if anyone asks you what happened here, tell them the truth. That even in war's darkest hour, mercy is possible. Tell them that enemies can become friends when someone is brave enough to extend the first hand. Tell them that the smile you feared most became the symbol of hope you never expected." As the ship carrying Miyako, Keiko, Harumi, Sachiko, Yuki, and hundreds of other women pulled away from the dock, they stood at the railing watching the British soldiers on shore. And in a moment that would be seared into memory forever, those soldiers, exhausted warriors who had fought through hell, raised their hands and smiled, not in mockery or triumph, but in farewell, in blessing, in a final affirmation of their shared humanity. The women smiled back, some for the first time since the war began, and in those smiles was a promise to remember, to forgive, to live in a way that honored the mercy they had received. Years later, when these women told their stories to their children and grandchildren, they spoke of many things about the war, the loss, the suffering, the propaganda that had poisoned their minds. But they always returned to one moment above all others, the moment they saw British soldiers smile at them with genuine kindness, and how that single gesture shattered years of lies and revealed a truth more powerful than any weapon. They spoke of Captain Whitmore, who chose humanity over hatred despite having lost his own brother. They spoke of young medics who treated their wounds with gentle hands. They spoke of soldiers who shared their rations, showed pictures of their families, and treated prisoners not as enemies, but as people worthy of dignity. And they spoke of how that mercy, unexpected and undeserved in their own minds, became the foundation for their own transformation, teaching them that true strength lies not in domination but in compassion, not in vengeance but in forgiveness, not in following propaganda but in recognizing the humanity in everyone, even those we've been taught to hate. This story reminds us of profound truths we desperately need in our divided world today. It teaches us that the narratives we're fed about the other are often designed to dehumanize, to make cruelty easier and compassion harder. It shows us that real courage isn't found in perpetuating cycles of hatred, but in being the one who chooses to break them. It demonstrates that mercy isn't weakness. It's the strongest power available to us, the power to transform enemies into friends, to turn the page on history's darkest chapters, and to choose the kind of world we want to live in rather than accepting the one hatred would build for us. The Japanese women POWs expected cruelty and received kindness. They were prepared for death and given life. They anticipated revenge and experienced grace. And in that gap between expectation and reality, everything changed. Captain Whitmore and his soldiers could have chosen differently. They had justification, authorization, and precedent for harsh treatment. They had personal reasons for anger and institutional reasons for punishment. But they chose the harder path, the path that required more strength than violence ever could, the path of mercy. And in doing so, they proved that even after years of propaganda, brutality, and war, the human capacity for compassion remains undefeated. So the next time you're tempted to believe that those people are beyond redemption, remember these British soldiers who saw beyond the uniform to the human being. Next time you're told that mercy is naive or that hatred is justified, remember these Japanese women who discovered that their greatest enemies were also capable of their greatest kindness. The next time you wonder whether one person's choice to show compassion really matters, remember that a few soldiers' decision to smile changed hundreds of lives forever and rippled through generations. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think differently about mercy, forgiveness, and our shared humanity, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible true stories that reveal the best of human nature even in the worst circumstances. Drop a comment below telling me how this story affected you, whether you've ever experienced unexpected kindness from someone you thought was your enemy, or what this teaches you about breaking cycles of hatred in your own life. Your COULDN engagement doesn't just help this channel, it spreads a message that our world desperately needs right now. And remember, in a world that constantly tells us to fear, to divide, to hate those who are different from us, the most revolutionary act is to choose mercy. The most radical stance is to see the humanity in everyone. The bravest thing you can do is be the first to smile at someone who expects your cruelty. Because you never know, that smile might be the thing that changes everything.